This is a stitch that shows up in most every class I teach. It's called ropes. It happens when you repeat that overplate row. People consider it an irregularity, but it can be used quite effectively as a lace stitch. Here's how you do it on purpose. At the same time, let me introduce you to the way I write out patterns for sprang. I've got 7 loops set on my frame. This means 14 threads. To map out the pattern for these 14 threads, I'll take a piece of graph paper and I'll mark off 14 squares. The first stitch involves the first 2 threads, so I make a slash through the first 2 squares, indicating a stitch. Here's the second stitch, and the third. Each stitch uses 2 threads. That means 2 squares. That's the initial row. Threads cross in pairs. For the next row, we'll have another set of 14 squares. The first stitch on a plate row has you pick up 2 threads, put 1 down. That's 3 threads. I call this a right edge stitch, and the notation is a slash that goes through 3 squares. You then work plain stitches, pick 1 up, put 1 down. Each of these stitches has 2 threads, so 2 squares. Pick up and put down all the way across. At the end of the plate or braiding row, you pick up 1, put 2 down. That's 3 threads, so 3 squares, and I call this a left edge stitch. For clarity, people like it when I color code the right edge and left edge stitch to distinguish them one from the other. In plain interlinking, the next row will be an overplate or follow-up row. We'll work plain stitches all the way across. That's 2 threads in each stitch. And this is how I would work such a row. Pick 1 up, put 1 down. Each stitch uses 2 threads all the way across the overplate row. And here's where we get into some interesting things with writing patterns. What happens if, after working an overplate row, you work the next row exactly the same way? You use 2 threads for each stitch all the way across the row. The resulting structure looks like ropes. And on the pattern, we see boxes of stitches all stacked up. I use heavy dark lines to indicate holes between stitches. And this is what it looks like when you work that overplate or follow-up row twice, one right after the other. It looks like ropes or extra long holes. To close the holes, work a braiding row. That is, you start with a right edge stitch, pick up 2, put 1 down. You work plain stitches all the way across. See how this closes those holes created by the ropes? And you end the row with a left edge stitch. Pick up 1, put 2 down. And this is what it looks like now. Those extra long holes now closed. After the plate row comes the overplate row, and you might work that overplate row twice to continue that lacy effect. Now, let me go back a minute. Wait a minute. If we're going to do that row twice, there is another option. It's called full twists. I can take each pair all the way around, doing each stitch twice, making a complete twist, and do 2 rows at once. The thread that starts at the back comes around the front, and then it returns to the back position. Something to be aware of if you're going to be working these full twists is that the stitches are going to rather resist pushing down to the mirror image side. It's probably a good idea to push them a few at a time. Make sure that they're nicely seated here at the bottom. Back up at the top of the frame, working full twists. Pick up and go all the way around and put down. Pick up, go all the way around and put down. Again, if you're working full twists, you need to take care with that mirror image row because the full twists, they have a tendency to go kind of screwy on you. You'll want to take extra care to make sure those full twists look nice in the mirror image row. Repeating these rows over and over could create a lovely lacy structure. To once again close off those holes made by the ropes, I work a plate row. Start with a right edge stitch, work plain stitches all the way across, pick up, put down, and then a left edge stitch. It makes a very pleasant, lacy pattern. Here's a neck scarf made using that rope stitch. If you're making a neck scarf, then the join is between the loops from the top and the bottom of the warp. You don't need to be concerned with the edge thread. You don't need that bead. I dealt with the middle by inserting a few weft threads, and I had no concern for keeping the edge thread at the edge. If, however, you want to make a pair of mittens, then you'll want to make a seam. Here I used that under 3 interlinking stitch for the first few rows to snug up the cuff. And then I worked this lacy stitch. Anticipating that seam, wanting to make an invisible seam, I did something slightly different. The ropes in these gloves are slightly longer than in the neck scarf. I made a slight adjustment in the pattern to allow for an invisible seam. The pattern in the neck scarf and the mittens is very similar, almost the same, but not quite. Let me show you the modification for the invisible seam. If I'm wanting to make an invisible seam, then what I'll do is I will repeat that overplate row 3 times. I'll do 3 twists on the rope. Every time that overplate row comes up, I'll work it 3 times. And what that does is, after that 3rd twist, then the bead is back to the proper position for a braiding row. The bead is at the back. I pick up 2, put 1 down for my braiding row. The braiding row closes the holes created by the ropes, and then I can work another set of 3 twists to continue the pattern of ropes, and at the same time to allow for an invisible seam. For more information, check out my website, spranglady.com.